I am sending this video out to my students to follow up with my invitation this year to begin to start looking at the patterned parts of your behavior, the reactivity, the inner dialogue, as being related all to the inner child. Often we think of it in terms of the ego. But since the inner child structure is the core of the ego, I'm finding it useful and helpful for people to start by identifying whatever's coming up. If it's anger, judgment of yourself or others, hatred of yourself or others, thickness, avoidance, whatever you find as kind of repetition, as a reaction, even tension patterns in your body. Rather than struggle around where it's coming from, we can actually start by placing them in the category of inner child. That we know that these reactions formed in the child structure. And when I say child structure, which is a very general term across psychology and spirituality, but for these purposes, using the broadest possible category. We know the structure develops mostly between birth and 3 years old, forming more definitively 5, 6, 7. There's of course, some development between 7 and 14 and some influence in the womb prenatally. But all of these experiences that we have cause the soul to identify with a self-image, meaning the soul moves away from the immediacy of experience, organizes part of itself around a self-image, a young self-image, including the body image. And this then engages the survival instinct to be identified with this self-image. So when I say structure of the inner child, we want to respect that this structure has with it the survival instinct aligned with it, which, as we know, makes it immensely challenging to work with. Now, by identifying our reactions, our inner dialogue, our repetitive thoughts as coming from the inner child, it's not meant to dismiss it. In fact, what it does is orient us to the reality of how it developed. It developed out of pain, out of hurt, out of fear, out of the inability of the soul to stay close to itself, to stay close to the immediacy of experience. And so in daily life, when we find ourselves angry or feeling hatred or feeling dullness or feeling distracted, we can actually immediately say, that's the child. That's my inner child. Even, as I said, with the inner dialogue, if we're walking around and we know this kind of conversation's going, that's a way for the inner child not to be with the immediacy of his experience, because the immediacy of experience is threatening. When we're with the immediacy of our experience, the agitation starts to go. The thinking we know starts to open up. The openness in our heart feels like a threat. And so we can skip a few steps, basically, is what I'm encouraging people to do. And then the inquiry can happen from there. But if we identify these reactions, these reactive patterns, as coming from the inner child, generally we can evoke a kind of kindness more easily. Naming it as the ego tends not to bring as much kindness. When we see, oh, this is the inner child, there's a natural development of the inner child, and the inner child's scared or hurt, it's more natural to bring the kindness. Now, kindness by itself is not enough for the inquiry, but starting in that place where there's both the holding and the disidentification allows the inquiry to unfold much easier. Now, if you want, you can spend time looking at various ways where the inner child may or may not be at play, like in terms of sadness or in terms of fear. Right? What's a natural instinctual fear as opposed to what's a historically based reaction? The same with sadness. Those are worthy inquiries, but generally, what I'm encouraging people to do for most of our experience is not feeling physically threatened directly or necessarily feeling the sadness of the human condition. Most of our reactive behavior is not really involved with those two. But by identifying them as the structure of the child structure that's formed by needing to leave the immediacy of experience. And of course, bringing in what we worked in last year, which was the deepest heart's desire, which for most of us is moving close to the immediacy of experience, whether it's love of truth, love of freedom. Understanding these forces of the love of truth, the power of the structure of the inner child, and the kindness, the force of the kindness that's so helpful in working with it, we can relieve a lot of wasted energy in some way. We can know if the superego comes up, that's the structure of the child. If we're judging someone else, that's the structure of the child. If we're angry at ourselves, if we're angry at a politician or our partner, we know really the source of that is this child. The wanting to know, the repetitive wanting to know, that's from the inner child. So the inner child both moves away from difficult experiences, but it also moves away from essential experiences. As you noticed, having deep experiences of peace, quiet, love, power, brilliancy. The inner child, because it lives on this kind of identification with an agitation, with a separateness from true nature, it will be challenged. Its survival is challenged by the peace. Every essential aspect has the peace. So we will find both, whether you're sitting and meditating or having this deep experience, that after a while it'll become intolerable for the inner child and it will attempt to move away by bringing in some thought, by actually doing some activity, sometimes even before you realize it. And rather than thinking, I'm not a good meditator, I'm not a serious student, I have a monkey mind, we can look at that movement and say, oh, that's a natural movement of this deep structure. It's a natural movement towards ongoing agitation. That's the way the inner child developed and identifies with. And that's the personality, that's the ego structure. It knows itself as the agitation. So can experiment for the next few months and notice what it's like to, anytime any of these reactive patterns or behaviors or emotions arise, notice what happens if you first identify that as the inner child. What you probably notice is there's some immediate disidentification that happens. Not dissociation, disidentification. And then in seeing it more clearly, the kindness can come. And then so there's a holding to understand it, not vilify it, not be in a fight with it. Realize that's a deep, powerful part of the soul. It's not the whole soul. We're not always identified with the inner child. As you know, in our experiences of beauty and brilliancy and power, appreciation. So we're a mix. And this structure of the inner child is incredibly powerful because it's aligned with the survival instinct. The more we can turn towards it with objectivity, knowing where it comes from, and the kindness which it responds to, the more these structures will start to loosen, or I should say, the less we'll be identified with them, so the less power they'll have. Now, it's true that the structure of the inner child doesn't have inherent existence. It's a self-image. And we know that, and that insight is very helpful sometimes. But the reality is, it won't really move. It won't transform until we come to meet it, until we turn towards it with our understanding and our kindness or love. So that's the invitation for these few months, and we'll see how it goes. And we look forward to hearing about it. Till next time.